Hi, I'm Vince, and today I'm presenting firmware hacking. Alright, so our project focused on firmware hacking and why it's such an important security concern. Firmware basically acts as the middleman between the hardware and the software. It's what controls how a device starts up, communicates, and stays stable. Because it's so deeply built into the system, once the firmware gets compromised, it can have serious consequences. We actually got interested in this topic while working in the embedded systems lab, where we saw firsthand how easy it was to access or even modify firmware using simple interfaces like UART or JTAG. That experience made us realize how vulnerable many devices really are. The issue is that firmware is often the weakest link. Things like unsigned updates, expose deport, expose debug ports, and unprotected bootloaders make it easy for attackers to install persistent malware or backdoors. And since billions of IoT devices are out there in homes and industries, many without regular updates or strong protection, this problem scales fast. For example, a single compromised router's bootloader can survive resets and software reinstalls, turning it into a permanent tool for attackers. So that's why we decided to focus on this topic, understanding how these attacks happen and how we can design stronger security measures to prevent them. This slide shows some of the most common types of firmware attacks and the defenses currently being used to counter them. Starting with common attacks, one of the main approaches involves physical interfaces such as JTAG, SWD, UART, or SPI. These are hardware connections used for testing and debugging, but attackers can take advantage of them to directly read or modify a device's memory. Techniques like bus tapping or sniffing allow data to be intercepted as it moves between components. Another common method is firmware extraction and analysis. In this case, attackers might dump the device's flash memory either by physically removing the chip, known as a chip-off method, or through debugging tools. Once they have the firmware image, they can use reverse engineering programs like Binwalk or Ghidra to understand the code and identify the vulnerabilities, or even patch the bootloader logic to bypass security checks. There are also logical attacks, which don't require physical access. These include supply chain injections, malicious over-the-air updates, or downgrade and rollback exploits that trick the device into accepting outdated, insecure firmware versions. To counter these threats, several defensive measures are commonly used. Secure boot and cryptographic signature verification ensure that only trusted signed firmware can run on the device.
Our project focuses on firmware reverse engineering tools, specifically Radar 2 and CLE. The goal is to understand how these tools work, their strengths and weaknesses, and how they can reveal vulnerabilities in hardware systems. Radar 2 is used for binary analysis, disassembling, and debugging. It allows deep inspection of how a program operates at the machine level, but has a steep learning curve and can be hard to use on complex code. Still, once mastered, it's a powerful tool for firmware research and hacking. CLE, on the other hand, is a symbolic virtual machine built on the LLVM compiler framework. It automatically explores a program paths to uncover bugs or vulnerabilities. However, it's resource intensive and relies on a lot of pre-known information. Our project will compare how both tools perform and firmware analysis and identify which is more effective at finding weaknesses. By the end, we hope to better understand firmware, hacking methods, and how to defend systems against these attacks.
My name is Andrew, and I'm going over the outcome slide, which just shows how our project tests how well firmware protections hold up under real attacks. We measured CPU overhead, detection accuracy, and resistance to compromise after a reboot. And highlighted in yellow is our goal, which is under 2% CPU cost, a small attestation size, and detection of 90% of injected firmware events with minimal false positives. In order to test this, we run attacks like voltage glitching, bootloader exploits, and firmware extraction, using a variety of tools such as OpenOCD, Bus Pirate, Ghidra, and Binwalk to cover all our bases. These methods mirror those described in our two sources, which will be showed later, which basically say that flaws like weak authentication, unencrypted communication, and poor update control make IoT devices easy to hack.
For our project plan, we divided the work into 5 main weeks to stay organized and ensure each phase built on the last. In week 1, we will research firmware hacking fundamentals and protection methods to build a solid foundation. In week 2, we will catalog hardware interfaces and vulnerabilities. Vince and Andrew are going to analyze software and hardware issues, while I set up the testing environment for accurate data collection. During week 3, we will run attack simulations and gather performance data. Andrew is doing testing while Vince works on secure boot verification. In week 4, I focus on verifying and evaluating the secure boot setup to measure efficiency and overhead. Finally, in week 5, we compile the results, evaluate security metrics, and finalize the presentation. This weekly plan should keep us on track and ensure steady progress throughout the project.
Here's our conclusion slide. I'm not just going to read off of it word for word. Basically, firmware hacking isn't just a theory or made up. It's a real threat to the devices we use every day, like our routers or our smart home gadgets, or really any hardware running unprotected firmware, and which can become an attacker's entry point. Through our research, we learned how easily these vulnerabilities can be exploited when security is overlooked. The most effective protection comes from layering practical defenses like secure boot, firmware authentication, and hardware-backed attestation. Our approach focuses on keeping the protection strong but still usable, so developers can secure devices without adding too much cost or complexity. Overall, this project showed us that understanding how hackers think is just as important as building defenses, because that's the only way to design solutions that truly hold up in the real world. Our citations include these two articles, which are the review of IoT firmware vulnerabilities and auditing techniques. This one basically reviews the modern IoT firmware vulnerabilities and tools and shows how attackers exploit flaws in access control, communication, and firmware updates. Our second article, Think Like a Hacker, gives real-world examples of hacked medical devices, namely insulin pumps and pacemakers, and highlights the urgent need for secure coding, encryption, and tamper-proofing.